If you stop watching the story before the end, what happens next will not be my responsibility, because everything I am about to tell you is real, documented, and still unexplained to this day, and it all begins on the outskirts of Detroit, Michigan, where an abandoned industrial structure known as the Black Iron Warehouse has been standing in silence for more than 4 decades. A place so feared that even locals refuse to say its name after sunset. A place where time feels frozen and the air itself feels wrong. Because back in 1987, this warehouse was one of the largest metal storage facilities in the region, employing dozens of night shift workers who were responsible for loading and unloading heavy iron shipments, until one cold October night when something went horribly wrong. Because during a routine shift, 7 workers entered the warehouse at 11 p.m. and never came back out, and when the morning supervisor arrived at 6 a.m., the warehouse doors were locked from the inside. The lights were still on, the machines were running, but the workers were gone, leaving behind their boots, helmets, and personal belongings neatly placed near their workstations as if they had simply vanished into thin air. And despite weeks of investigation, police found no signs of forced entry, no blood, no bodies, and no explanation, which eventually led the company to permanently shut down the warehouse and seal it off. But sealing the building did not stop the rumors, because residents living nearby began reporting strange sounds coming from the structure after midnight, including the sound of heavy chains being dragged across concrete floors, distant screams echoing through night, and sometimes the unmistakable sound of someone knocking from the inside, even though the building was supposed to be empty. And over time, these stories became urban legends passed down from generation to generation, warning people never to go near the warehouse after dark, especially not alone. But decades later, in the age of social media and viral content, these warnings were ignored by a young American YouTuber named Alex Carter, who had built a growing online following by exploring abandoned and supposedly haunted locations across the United States, always claiming that fear was nothing more than imagination and that every paranormal story had a logical explanation. And when Alex first heard about the Black Iron Warehouse, he laughed it off, calling it the perfect clickbait location, believing that the exaggerated legends would make for great content and bring millions of views. And despite receiving dozens of messages from locals begging him not to go, some even warning him that people who enter the warehouse at night never come out the same, Alex announced to his audience that he would be doing an overnight challenge inside the building, promising to stay until sunrise and prove once and for all that the warehouse was nothing more than an abandoned pile of rust and steel. And on the night of his investigation, October 13th, Alex arrived at the site just before midnight with his camera equipment, flashlight, and body mic, joking with his viewers as he stood outside the massive iron gates that were covered in graffiti, rust, and warning signs that had long since faded. And as the clock on his phone turned to 11:45 p.m., the atmosphere around him seemed to change. The wind suddenly died. The distant city noise faded into silence, and an unnatural stillness settled over the area. But Alex brushed it off his nerves and continued recording, explaining the history of the warehouse and mocking the idea that ghosts of factory workers could still be trapped inside until something unexpected happened. Because without him touching it, the heavy metal gate let out a long, painful creak and slowly began to open on its own, stopping Alex mid-sentence, forcing an awkward laugh as he claimed it must be the wind even though there was none. And as he stepped inside the warehouse, the temperature dropped so fast that his breath became visible in the air, and the smell inside was overwhelming, a mixture of rust, oil, damp concrete, and something else that was hard to describe, something rotten and old, like decay that had been sealed away for years. And while walking deeper into the building, Alex's confident tone slowly began to change as his flashlight revealed endless rows of broken machinery, hanging chains swaying slightly even though nothing was touching them, and walls stained with dark marks that looked disturbingly like dried blood. And although he tried to maintain his composure for the camera, small details began to unsettle him, such as the fact that his phone's signal dropped to 0 the moment he crossed the entrance. His camera battery started draining unusually fast, and the echo of his own footsteps sounded delayed, as if something else was walking behind him, matching his pace. But the most disturbing moment came when Alex paused to listen after hearing what he thought was movement. And in the complete silence of the warehouse, a low, heavy whisper slowly formed right next to his ear, clear enough to be recorded by his microphone, saying only 3 words in a calm, emotionless tone: "You shouldn't be here." The moment those 3 words were whispered into Alex's ear, his entire body went cold, not just from fear, but from a sudden, deep sense that he was no longer alone in the warehouse. And although he spun around with his flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam revealed nothing but endless darkness and rusted steel. Yet the microphone on his camera had clearly picked up the voice, replaying it back in a distorted echo that made his heart race as he nervously laughed and tried to reassure both himself and his viewers that it must have been interference or his own imagination. But as he continued walking deeper into the building, the atmosphere became heavier with every step, as if the air itself was pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. And that was when he noticed that the hanging chains he had seen earlier were now gently swaying in unison, even though there was no wind and no vibration from outside. And as Alex focused his camera on them, the chains suddenly stopped all at once, creating a silence so complete that it felt deafening, followed immediately by the distant sound of metal scraping against concrete somewhere far inside the warehouse, a slow, deliberate dragging noise that echoed to the massive structure. And although every instinct told him to turn back, Alex forced himself forward, reminding his audience that abandoned buildings often made strange noises due to temperature changes and settling metal. Yet his voice trembled slightly as he spoke, betraying the fear he was trying so hard to hide. And as he moved past rows of old conveyor belts and towering storage racks, his flashlight briefly illuminated something on the floor that made him stop dead in his tracks. Because lying in the dust were 7 old, rusted helmets placed in a perfect line, each one cracked and stained as if they'd been dropped decades ago. And when Alex bent down to examine them, he realized that the names of the missing workers were still faintly visible on the inside, written in permanent marker, which made no sense because official reports had stated that no personal items were ever recovered from the warehouse. And as he stood back up, a loud metallic bang echoed from above, causing him to flinch and point his camera toward the ceiling, where he caught a brief glimpse of movement along the overhead catwalks. Something tall and unnatural that disappeared the moment the light touched it. And at that point, Alex whispered to the camera that he was starting to feel uneasy and that the warehouse was definitely more intense than expected. But before he could say anything else, every light inside the building suddenly flickered on, bathing the warehouse in a harsh yellow glow, revealing the full scale of the decay around him, including deep scratch marks carved into walls, handprints smeared across the metal surfaces, and long trails on the floor that looked as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly from one end of the building to the other. And as Alex slowly turned in place, trying to take it all in, he realized with growing panic that the entrance he had come to was no longer visible, replaced instead by a solid wall of rusted steel, as if the building itself had rearranged its layout. And when he rushed toward where the exit should have been, pounding on the metal and shouting for help, his voice echoed back at him in a distorted, delayed manner, repeating his own words in a deeper, mocking tone that did not belong to him. And that was when the shadows began to move, because along the far end of the warehouse, 7 dark shapes slowly detached themselves from the walls, standing upright in unnatural positions, their forms vaguely human but stretched and broken, as if their bodies had been twisted by years of suffering. And as Alex backed away in terror, the temperature dropped again, frost forming on the metal surfaces and creeping along the floor toward his feet, while the sound of chains dragging grew louder and closer, circling him from all directions. And when he finally screamed and begged for whoever was there to stop, the shadows tilted their heads in perfect synchronization, and a deep, hollow voice echoed to the warehouse, not from one direction, but from everywhere at once, saying, "We never left." The moment the voice said, "We never left," Alex felt his legs give way beneath him, his back hitting the cold concrete floor as his camera continued to record, capturing the way the 7 shadowy figures began to move closer, not by walking, but by gliding across the floor, their forms flickering like broken frames of old footage. And as they approached, the warehouse lights overhead started to burst one by one, plunging sections of the building into darkness, until only Alex's flashlight remained, shaking violently in his hand as he struggled to stand, his breathing loud and uneven, fogging the lens while he begged him to stay back, promising to leave and never return. But his words seemed meaningless as the shadows stopped just a few feet away, stretching upward until they nearly touched the ceiling. And in that moment, the air filled with the smell of burning metal and oil, triggering a memory Alex couldn't explain, as if the warehouse itself was forcing him to relive something that had happened long before he was born, because suddenly the walls around him changed, peeling away their rusted surfaces to reveal the warehouse as it once was in 1987, fully operational, brightly lit, and filled with the sounds of machinery and shouting workers. And Alex realized in horror that he was no longer alone in the present, but trapped inside the final moments of that long-forgotten night, watching as 7 exhausted men worked the late shift, unaware of what was about to happen. And before Alex could process what he was seeing, a deafening crash echoed to the building as one of the massive iron storage racks collapsed, sealing off the exits and igniting a chain reaction of explosions that sent sparks raining down like fire. And as the workers screamed and ran, the sprinklers failed, the alarm stayed silent, and the doors refused to open just as Alex's had, forcing him to understand the truth, that the warehouse wasn't haunted by ghosts wandering aimlessly, but by souls trapped in a loop of betrayal and abandonment, because management had knowingly locked them inside that night to prevent theft during a shipment inspection, leaving them to die when the accident occurred. And as the memory dissolved and the warehouse returned to its ruined state, Alex felt hands grip his arms, no longer shadowy but solid, burned, and painfully cold, pulling him toward the center of the building where a massive, charred figure stood waiting, taller than the rest, its body twisted and fused with melted chains and metal beams, its face barely human, yet its eyes painfully aware, and when it spoke, its voice was layered with 7 others, each filled with rage and sorrow, saying, "Someone must stay to remember." And Alex screamed as he tried to break free, dropping his flashlight and camera to the floor, causing the footage to tilt upward and capture the horrifying transformation as the shadows began merging into him, their darkness crawling across his skin like living smoke, while memories that weren't as flooded his mind, memories of pain, fire, suffocation, and being forgotten. And as the screams slowly turned into hoarse whispers, his reflection appeared in a shattered piece of glass nearby, showing his eyes completely black, his expression frozen in terror, yet unnaturally still. And in the final moment of the recording, Alex picked up the camera one last time, his movements stiff and unnatural, staring directly into the lens as if looking through it at every future viewer. And with a calm voice that no longer sounded like his own, he said, "They needed someone to take our place," before the screen cut to static. And when police later reviewed the footage after finding the camera placed neatly outside the warehouse the next morning, they found no signs of Alex anywhere inside, no footprints, no blood, no evidence that he had ever been there at all, except for one final detail that made even the most experienced investigators refuse to return, because during their inspection, officers reported seeing 8 shadows reflected on the warehouse walls instead of 7, and long after the case was closed and dismissed as another missing persons mystery, locals continue to report that if you stand outside the Black Iron warehouse after midnight, you can hear the faint sound of a camera clicking on from inside, followed by a familiar whisper carried through cracks in the walls, saying, "Stay till the end." And those who ignore the warning claim that when they look at the building long enough, one of the shadows slowly turns its head, as if watching them back, waiting for the next person willing to step inside and take someone else's place.